Good evening, friends. It is good to see you. Mozart once famously praised the organ, writing, and I quote, "In my eyes and ears, it is the king of instruments." We are so pleased, friends, that you're here tonight to hear this organ played by one of the best and finest living musicians in the world today. My name is Jared Wilson. I'm one of the clergy members here at Madison Street, and we are delighted to have you with us. Per request from the Clarksville Community Concert Association, they've asked me to spend a bit of time tonight talking about the history and function of the organ, particularly for those of you for whom the organ might be a new instrument, to give you some specifics about this particular instrument, and to reflect on some of the pieces that you'll hear in tonight's concert. So to begin with, we don't know exactly when the organ was invented, per se. We do know that organ-like instruments began appearing in Egypt around 300 BCE. In fact, it's the Greek inventor Ctesibius who is often credited with developing the first of these instruments in Alexandria. This instrument was called a hydraulis, and it had the basic elements that define what an organ actually is: a row of pipes, one for each note, with a key for each one to admit the air, which was then supplied by the bellows. The number of pipes in an instrument like this ranged anywhere from 4 to 18, and we don't really know how any of them were tuned, but we do know a bit about the mechanics. There was a pump on each side of the instrument providing the air, and the pressure was stabilized by a tank of water, hence the name hydraulis. And really, since that time, builders have followed that basic model, minus the water, to create what is now one of the most complex of all musical instruments. And yet, even today, there are really only three main parts to the construction of any organ: the wind-raising device, often called the bellows. In this instrument, those are up here and out in the hall. The wind chest, also sometimes called the soundboard, which houses all of the pipes. And the keyboard and the valve mechanism, which allows the air to flow into the pipes. Now, since the Industrial Revolution and the advent of computer technology, there have been huge advances in how organs work and how they function. Madison Street's organ, the console of which you see right here, is a very complicated piece of machinery. One person told me one time that it looks like, the cockpit of an airplane or something. Much of the console is computer controlled, giving us many different options on how to program different sounds on the organ with all of the different buttons that you see here. And yet, behind all of that, the instrument is still basically a collection of pipes, some large, some small, played by a wind supply that the organ keys release. Had it not been for one man in the mid-19th century, however, I think it's very possible that we would have never seen an instrument quite like this. In fact, without his pioneering efforts, it's quite probable that the musical world might have bypassed the organ altogether as little more than an historical curiosity. Aristide Cavaillé-Coll was a French organ builder who truly took the organ to a new level during a time when music was making huge demands on instruments of all types. He pioneered innovations in the art and science of organ building that permeated the profession and influenced the course of organ building, and not only organ building, but also composing and improvising for the instruments through the early 20th century. He was the inventor of what we call the symphonic organ, which allowed for really smooth and immediate dynamic changes, much like in a symphony orchestra. He adjusted pipe making and voicing techniques, creating a whole family of harmonic stops imitating, and stops also that imitate orchestral instruments, such as the bassoon or the oboe and things like that. I'll show you a couple of those on this particular instrument that are some of my favorite. The lovely English horn that we can hear here, or the oboe. or one of my favorites, this lovely French horn on this instrument. Just a couple of those sort of symphonic instruments that we hear replicated on the organ. And Cavaillé-Coll also gave us the pneumatic combination action system, which allows us to program combinations of sounds on this particular instrument. Those are all controlled by these buttons here. You can sort of see the stops fly in and out as you press these buttons that are giving us all different sorts of combinations of sounds that you'll hear tonight. His most famous organs were built in Paris, in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, Saint-Clotilde, the Church of Saint-Sulpice, and Notre Dame Cathedral, the organ at which our esteemed guest this evening presides. Now, for those of you who have been wanting to know but you haven't had the opportunity to ask, let me give you an update on Notre Dame. Though he would never, ever admit this, I am quite sure that Mr. Latry is tired of answering these questions. So let's just get this out of the way. As you know, since the massive fire of Notre Dame in 2019, it's been in a constant state of rebuilding and refurbishment, and it is on track to reopen again by the end of 2024. For those concerned about the great organ, I think we are all very thankful that it sustained very little damage apart from smoke and soot. It was removed shortly after the fire, and it has been cleaned and refurbished, and will go back into its spot in the organ loft, sounding much the way it did when it was rebuilt by Monsieur Cavaillé-Coll in 1867. I think we all give thanks for that, as so many of us around the world mourned at the time of that tragic fire. On a much smaller scale, but certainly no less emotionally intense, the people of this church, Madison Street United Methodist Church, also know something about the loss of a sacred space for worship. In January of 1999, Madison Street, along with a good portion of our historic downtown area, was destroyed by a tornado. Along with the destruction of this sanctuary and other parts of the facility was also the destruction of the 1892 Jardine organ. Only a very few of the individual pipes remain. 3 of those you'll find in the narthex mounted on the wall as you enter or exit the sanctuary. And during Madison Street's 3-year rebuilding period, the design of a new organ was a top priority for this congregation. After a great deal of work in narrowing down who the next organ builder would be, the church settled on the Rieger-Claus Organ Company in the Czech Republic. Rieger-Claus dates their establishment to 1873. They claim a common history with the much celebrated Rieger Organ Company in Austria up until the end of World War II. Following the war, the Czechoslovakian government expelled the ethnic German owners and workers in the original firm and nationalized the Rieger Company. And in 1948, they were merged with a workshop of Joseph Claus, who also had been nationalized, to form the new company of Rieger-Claus. The workers and owners of the original firm were then relocated and opened a new shop in Austria. By 1958, however, Rieger-Claus had nearly 50 commissions to build organs throughout the Soviet Union. And today they have built over 600 organs throughout Europe, with a handful here in the United States and in Asia. The Madison Street organ, like all pipe organs, was designed specifically for this room. The case behind me stands 3 stories tall and includes some of the largest pipes in the instrument at 32 feet in the facade. The first requirement in planning the design of this organ was to play the liturgy of the church, to accompany great hymn singing, to provide choral accompaniments for voices of all ages, and to inspire the worship service. There's really not a single voice on this organ that might not be used in a regular worship service, and as we'll hear tonight, it can play a fabulous concert. Under the very careful guidance of designer Bill Gray, who, if you are a member of the Nashville American Guild of Organists community, he is no stranger to us. This instrument was designed as an instrument of distinction, not really to copy any other organ, although there are many historical influences that are present in its design. For example, the organ's largest division is actually right here, the grand choir, which is a design that was greatly influenced by Aristide Cavaillé-Coll in the French School of Organ Building. And it gives the organ a great deal of versatility that you'll hear tonight. It has made a distinct impact on the cultural life of this community, and it has certainly been my privilege and honor to play it for the last 20 years. Friends, we have, again, the opportunity tonight to hear one of the world's finest organists, and his work is not going to only demonstrate his own virtuosity, but it's also going to explore the beautiful colors and tones of this instrument. I wanted to spend just a few minutes to talk about the pieces that Mr. Latry will perform this evening. As we would expect, this program features some of the great masters of French organ music, Marcel Dupré, Olivier, Charles-Marie Widor. He opens tonight's concert with a transcription of the Sinfonia from Cantata 29 of Johann Sebastian Bach. And that transcription is by Marcel Dupré. Dupré was a child prodigy born in 1886 to a wealthy musical family in France. And though his talents were recognized early in his life, he really became famous for performing more than 2,000 organ recitals throughout Australia and the United States and Canada and Europe, which included a recital series of 10 concerts of the complete works of Bach in 1920, which he performed entirely from memory. And the sponsorship of an American transcontinental tour by the John Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia really is what rocketed his name into international prominence. In addition to his work as a concert artist, however, he also succeeded Widor as the titular organist at Saint-Sulpice in Paris. And he taught 2 generations of really, really important French organists, including Jean Alain, Marie-Claire Alain, Pierre Cochereau, Jean Demessieux, Jean Langlais, and Olivier Messiaen, just to name a few. Dupré's works for the organ range from moderately to extremely difficult, and some of it makes almost impossible technical demands of the performer, at least from my perspective. But in addition to his transcription of the Bach this evening, we'll also hear his Cortege and Litany, which consists of 2 sections, the Cortege, Solemn Procession, which introduces the primary theme, followed by the introduction of the second theme of the Litany, which is a repeated prayer. In addition to Dupré, we will also hear works of Louis Vierne, who was the organist at the Cathedral of Notre Dame from 1900 until his death in 1937. Vierne was born nearly blind due to congenital cataracts. His unusual gift for music, however, was discovered really early. When he was only 2 years old, he heard the piano for the first time, and his neighbor played him a Schubert lullaby, and after he had finished, the young Vierne promptly goes to the piano and begins to pick out the notes of the lullaby. He went on to study organ and harmony with César Franck, and I think Vierne's music is so full of the color that eluded him in life, and I think that truly his music was another dimension or another venue of sight for him. In June of 1937, Vierne gave his 1,750th concert at Notre Dame. He completed the main part of the concert, which members of the audience said showed him at his full power. And the closing of the concert was going to be 2 improvisations on submitted themes. He read the first theme in Braille, and then he selected the stops that he was going to use at the organ for the improvisation. And then suddenly, he pitched forward and fell off the bench. And as he did, his foot hit the low E of the pedal. and he lost consciousness as that single note echoed throughout the massive cathedral. And he had thus fulfilled his often stated lifelong dream to die at the console of the great organ of Notre Dame. And finally, tonight, we'll hear the music of Charles-Marie Widor, perhaps his most famous piece, Symphony No. 5, including the famous toccata. Widor was a prolific composer. Apart from his 10 symphonies for organ, he also wrote 3 symphonies for organ and orchestra, several songs for piano and voice, 4 operas, and a ballet. He was one of the very first composers to use the term symphony for some of his organ compositions, which had been helped along by the symphonic organs that were built by Aristide Cavaillé-Coll. In addition to his work as a prodigious composer, Widor also served as the titular organist of the Saint-Sulpice Church in Paris for 63 years. And last but not least, tonight you get to hear Olivier Latry improvise on a submitted theme. Now, jazz musicians learn to improvise. Classical musicians learn mostly to perform, but organists learn and study improvisation very seriously in France. And tonight we will hear one of the finest in the world. Students of organ at the Paris Conservatory, where Mr. Latry teaches, are required to take improvisation as a course, and more advanced practitioners major in improvisation after passing a pretty competitive examination. And that's one of the ways that France keeps alive a tradition that has long made its organ virtuosos admired all over the world. Marcel Dupré astounded American audiences in the 1920s by improvising whole organ symphonies on themes that listeners submitted right before his concert, in a tradition that's been carried on by such other French virtuosos as Pierre Cauchereau and Jean Langlais, and of course, tonight, Olivier Latry. I recently watched an interview with Daniel Roth, who was a successor of Dupré at the Church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris, and himself a brilliant improviser. And he said in this interview, improvisation is not at all easy. You have to study the whole of history of music. You have to assimilate the styles of various periods. You have to have a thorough knowledge of harmony and music theory, even to be able to start, and not everybody can do it well, even really fine performers. But tonight, of course, we will hear someone who can do it very well. This afternoon, Olivier came to my office and he said, "On what shall I improvise tonight?" And I thought about it for a while, and I said back to him, "Well, you are in Tennessee, so let's do something indigenous. So tonight, we will hear Olivier Latry improvise in the style and tradition of the great French organists on the Tennessee Waltz." I think it's going to be amazing. I really do. Friends, again, we are so pleased that you are here for this event, and I am so thankful that you showed up for this pre-conference talk. I didn't know exactly who would come to this, but it is a pleasure to see all of you. I hope that this has brought a slightly broader dimension to all of the wonderful music that we're going to hear and experience tonight. So thank you very much. Back for just a second. Thank you. We do have several minutes before